Thank you all for coming today. I'm Dawn. She's Sam, in case you don't know that. And we have Sarah Gauthier with us today, who's going to share her experience about transgendered individuals. We're all on our separate journeys in this lifetime, and I just think it's really special that the people who have come for a walk in their shoes have shared a part of themselves with us. And so Sarah's here to do that and promote love and education and just informing people about another way of living. And thank you for coming so much.
It's a little bit different, like having like a forum. Well, thank you, Don, for having me, allowing me this opportunity to come in and talk about the transgender identity. So I think let's start with like definition, like what does transgender mean? And like just a super quick introduction. So I'm an out and proud trans-identified female, and I have a salient voice for my community, and I'm an advocate for my community. I do a lot of work with LGBT youth who are most at risk for some of the mental health issues associated with being transgender. But what also has kind of come up is, I don't know if anybody went to Laverne Cox, but when she talks about the idea of being trans versus just being a female identified person or a male identified person, she really kind of embraced the idea that you need to acknowledge where you came from before you can accept where you're going. And understanding her male identity, her former male identity, helped her to embrace her current female identity. And I think that's important because in the transition process, it starts out where it's kind of a dark, cloudy area, a gray area, and you're not sure how to proceed and all that kind of stuff. But it's also kind of a disdain or a dislike for who you are at the present time, which causes you to kind of look into the idea of transitioning into who you feel like you identify on the inside. But without the acknowledgement of where you came from, like for me, for example, I have to kind of identify my former male role because that's kind of what educated me in like the male culture, and then gives me a different perspective in the female culture. So, I think one of the things that I wanted to say up front too is, at first, and when you're coming from the place where you're in that questioning phase and you're kind of not sure how to proceed and that sort of thing, it's a very ambiguous and scary place. It's kind of a dark place, but you get to that point where you reach that place of acceptance and denial is no longer an option. And I think that you get to that place where you're no longer afraid to be who you are. Like it's time to be honest about who you are, right? So that's kind of what I've done. So I think, like in the first place, what I'd like to do is maybe define what transgender is. In a lot of ways, being transgender or gender, in a lot of ways is culture, is kind of a sense of value, a set of values, a set of norms, kind of socially constructed norms, but that are relative to being either male or female. And you typically subscribe to those socially constructed norms based on how you identify, but it also has a lot to do with your identity. So your identity is really kind of how you feel you are kind of interact with the world and how the world interacts with you. So in a lot of ways, it's all about your identity and your culture, because your culture is going to kind of dictate how you're going to be, and your identity is going to tell you who you are and who you want to be, and kind of adapt the culture from there. It's kind of interesting because when you live in one culture, like the male culture, and you are socially constructed in that role, kind of everything you do is kind of male dominant or male specific. It's just very specifically masculine, heteronormative kind of stuff. And I can tell you that the roles as a female are entirely different, and I mean, we all know what the social norms expectations are around being male or female. But it definitely gives you a contextual understanding of your place in the world based on how you identify, or how I identify, I'm sorry. So the other thing too is so as I was growing up, I always felt like there was something off. There was something that was not really true about who I was. And I was trying to hide it and cover it up and, kind of, live according to the world and my parents' expectations as a young boy, and trying to figure out and navigate that space. But there was always something off about that. Like I didn't really fit. That wasn't my kind of stuff. It wasn't like my cup of tea or whatever. And I think along the way I began to realize there was a difference. I was kind of more kind of inclined to want to be doing like the girl activities, like hanging out with girls rather than boys. I really wanted nothing to do with masculine sports, pro, whatever, all the stuff that boys do, like riding the bikes and all that kind of stuff. But I think, so my sense of self started to develop when I was really young. I actually knew when I was about 9 years old that there was something off, that there was something amiss. But my sense of self really kind of started to develop through my teenage years, where I started realizing that, this is what I prefer, and this isn't really the normal male stuff to do. And of course, at that time, and I'm not a traditional age student, so I'm a little older. Back in the 80s when I was growing up, it's not really okay to come out and say, hey, I think I identify differently. Not even at that point that I even understood what that meant. So I tried to hide it, and I tried to just be what my parents expected me to be, and what my friends expected me to be, and what the world perceived me to be as this boy out there in this world. But the more and more I tried to do that, the more and more difficult it became to kind of maintain my happiness and kind of be in that place where I could say, okay, this is, my life is perfect, my life is great, my life is all happy and stuff. It wasn't like that. I started, as I entered the teenage years, I started to kind of, isolate a little bit. I detached from a lot of people. I really became kind of secluded in my own kind of thought process and my own mind. But also I didn't really have a whole lot of interest in socializing and that sort of thing. So that's when my sense of self started to change kind of rapidly. My understanding of who I was in the world still at that point wasn't really defined, because I didn't know what it meant to be different. All I knew was that, hey, I was born a boy, and this is like what people are telling me I'm supposed to be, but I don't feel like that. I think like kind of later on in my teenage years and maybe in my early 20s, I realized that it was kind of okay to be different, but I didn't even know what that difference looked like. It was still kind of an ambiguous idea. Just got to kind of let it take shape, I guess, and over time it did. So that's kind of a little bit about the past. So now I'm going to kind of bring it up to the current day. So I actually I've only been out and in full transition for about 3.5 years, 4 years now. I actually started transitioning, openly transitioning and openly identifying as a female when I started here at UAlbany, which was kind of neat. It had gotten to a point, one of the things that I do want to say as far as my past though, and my history, as I kept kind of developing my sense of self in the world, and I kept understanding who I was or how I was different, as I was saying, it became a very dark place for me. And so one of the things that kind of got me into social work, so this is actually kind of where I am at today, is all because of my identity and the struggle with that identity. So back in 2008, I had gotten to the point where I was just, like, I was chronically depressed. I was, really very miserable, like extremely miserable, like entirely unhappy with life and who I was and who I wasn't able to be and all that stuff. And as with many other trans-identified people, suicide was an option for many. One night on a Saturday night, I had gone home from work. I'd grabbed a 12-pack of beer, went home, and essentially slit my wrists, jumped in the bathtub, and said, this is it, I'm done, right? Fortunately, I woke up the next day. I had a lot of issues, but I woke up the next day. But it was in that kind of moment of, all the pain kind of came to this head, all this, misery and the sorrow and the sadness and all this darkness just kind of exploded that one night when I attempted to take my life. The next day when I had gotten up, I said, wait, there's something wrong here. This is kind of crazy. This is not okay. So it was at that point, it was kind of like an awakening where I said, okay, so I've got to either do a couple of things here. Either I've got to accept this, or I've got to deny it, or I've got to, one way or the other, it's either going to kill me or it's going to promote me. And I chose to let it promote me at that point in time because I realized that as unhappy as I was, that the potential for happiness was there. I just didn't know how to get there. So that's actually when I started the social work program or the human services program at Hudson Valley. I went through that program and then came over here. And then when I got here, I had enough kind of autonomy with the idea of, or playing around with, the idea of just being out full time. And I had met several people on campus that, especially the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, where I had the opportunity to talk with other people that were just like me. And even at Hudson Valley, there was some opportunity to do that, but not a whole lot. But it's really kind of when I got to UAlbany is when I flourished as far as that goes. And of course, Dawn has been one of my advocates almost from square one. So I think that's kind of, the history of where I came from and who I am. So I think as I kind of walk through my life today, it's much different. It went from kind of an uncertainty, unhappiness, miserable, dark places to a very liberating, very freeing experience of being out and being proud of who I am and not worrying about what other people are going to say. That, for some reason, that seems to be one of the biggest things that a lot of people worry about is, well, what are other people going to say or think about me? And I finally got to a place where, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If I'm living this miserable, then I'm living that way because somebody else thinks it might be wrong. That living the right way is wrong for me. And it was within that kind of understanding that I realized that, I'm not here living for you or you or you, I'm here living for me. And that's kind of when I made that decision to be out. There have been some challenges along the way. It hasn't been an easy transition. I guess, for starters, I guess coming into a new university where I don't know anybody and I'm unfamiliar with the program and I'm familiar with the administration and the students that I'm going to be meeting and that sort of thing, I kind of had to navigate that space with each individual that I came across or that I met along the way. One of the most profound things is that the interactions between people are different. So as a male-identified person, I was able to kind of go into male spaces and, opinions were warranted. They were actually requested. I had this sense of entitlement, I guess, where people would want me in that room to have these conversations about different things because I was kind of male-identified and it was what we did. That has significantly shifted. Now that I identify as female, I'm not always welcome in those spaces, and my opinions are not always wanted anymore, or warranted. Just because the whole dynamics between like the male culture and my female identity have collided now. There's like this disconnect between them. But even things like the bathrooms, like navigating the bathrooms. It's very scary that first day you walk into campus, you don't know anybody as far as students or staff or anybody else, and you are presenting as female for the first time and you need to walk in and use the bathroom. So you can't go into the men's room at this point because now, you're in jeopardy of being physically assaulted or even worse. And walking into that female bathroom is a very scary place too, because it's like, okay, so how am I going to be received in that area? How am I going to be received in that female space, that traditional female space? And it's kind of funny because the more and more I navigated those spaces, the more and more I realized that the other women in that bathroom with me did not care. It wasn't an issue to them. However, it is different in the men's room. They do care. They don't want me there. But even the interactions are different. So the way that men interact, they're kind of not really personalized. They're not really close. They're not really, intimate, like in thought with each other. Whereas women are very close, very more kind of on a cognizant level, more feelings and that type of stuff around their interactions. And that was kind of a weird kind of place for me to too, because I had to kind of figure out how to adjust my approach and my demeanor to kind of meet the new expectations of the new gender. So, so one of the things I like to talk about a lot is, and I always pose this as a question first, but since we're in a different type of setting, I wonder how many times everybody in the morning when they get up and they look in the mirror, they get out of the shower, they're getting dressed. When you look in the mirror, like, what do you think? You think about, maybe how does my hair look, or how do my clothes look? Do I have enough makeup on? Do I need to shave? All these different things for different people. But not many people look in that mirror and say, okay, so how does my gender look in the world today? Like, how does my presentation, how is that going to look in my interactions with everybody I deal with, when I go to school, when I go to work, when I go to the grocery store, when I go to everywhere? Because my gender as culture, as my identity, intersects with everything that I do. Every interaction, every person, every situation, my gender is a part of that. And not many people realize that when they're looking in the mirror. They don't look at themselves and say, okay, I look like a great guy today, or I look like a really attractive woman today. When you don't have the most attractive features as a woman, you need to work on that. But you also kind of need to plan your day according to how you're going to present too, because if you're going to, if you're going to a Bulls game, you're probably going to want to down dress a little bit just to be a little bit more androgynous, because it's, sports are typically more male oriented and more aggressive, that type of thing. So you don't necessarily want to go there and present, all out feminine. But then, if you're going to a concert or, a nice dinner with, open-minded people, you're going to dress a lot differently. You're going to dress more feminine or more, more maybe even risque or provocative sometimes, depending on the setting. So it's interesting when you have to get up in the morning and say, okay, so how does my gender going to intersect with the world today? How is it going to affect my relationships with my peers, with my administration, with my boss, my supervisor, all of these different things? And it does, like, without realizing it, everybody who identifies as female doesn't realize it necessarily, but everything that they do and all of their interactions with their supervisors and their bosses and that sort of thing are influenced by your gender as being female. And of course, the same holds true for men. The interactions and the outcome of that meeting are always kind of predicated on how you present and how you identify in those situations. And I think one space that I haven't really navigated yet, which there are a lot of affirming religious organizations in our area, but there's still something kind of inherently a little scary about going into like this religious organization, like a church, for example, and presenting differently than what they would expect in their church. But that's something else. I mean, even going to church, our spirituality kind of intersects with our gender and who we are and who we identify as. So, I think I lost my train of thought there. So I again, kind of going back to, how you interact with everyone around you. Like, I'm going to be different with men. I'm actually, I actually just discovered this. So, like, if I'm on the bus now and I see, like, this creepy dude on the bus with me, like, and this is the first time I actually did this the other day. Like, I was actually kind of creeped out. Like, he was giving me the eye, and I'm like, okay, this is not okay. So I actually got a little nervous and moved. And formerly, when I had identified as a male, I didn't think of those things. I didn't think of my safety, and I didn't think of my my ability to exist in that space without conflict or without any type of issues. And now that's something I think about a lot because, and I don't know, I haven't quite defined it in my own mind whether it's because I identify as female or it's because I still don't entirely pass 100%. So I can still be kind of called out on my trans identity. So I'm not sure which of those two is the more prominent part of that, but I think it's interesting to explore because I'm starting to realize that there's more safety issues or concerns out there for me as a female in the world than there are as male, than there were as male. So one of the things that did happen as I was kind of progressing in my transition was all these spaces that I used to be able to go to, like these male spaces and like the male friends that I had, and I was kind of slowly being disassociated with them, like you don't belong here anymore. And I don't. Again, this is another one of those questions where is it because I was trans or is it because I was identifying differently now as a female? But a lot of those interactions changed. They became kind of closed. They became more, less often, and I was asked to join them less often, to be a part of that less often. But when you're going in that place, when you're in that space, and you're kind of leaving this culture behind, and you're going into this culture, there's a very big gray area on how this is going to work. Like, how do I go from this culture and leave this culture behind and get accepted? It wasn't necessarily about going into that culture, but it was more or less about being accepted into that culture. And one of the things that I found is that, no offense to any of the men in the room, but men I have found in my transition process are a lot more closed-minded about the transition process or about the trans identity. Women are actually far more accepting, which was contrary to what I had known prior to transition. And I'm not sure exactly where I had gotten that information, but a lot of people had told me that women will not accept you as one of their own. But then you don't belong to the male culture either, so they don't accept you. So now where you're kind of in the middle of this, place that, nobody wants you to be a part of their culture. It was very inviting and very warm when I found out that, hey, now that I'm out in the world presenting as a female, women actually allow me to be a part of their culture, and I fit in those spaces that they belong in. But the types of interactions are different. Like, I have very close relationships now where prior to I never really had any close relationships. I mean, it could be because of the struggle that I was enduring, or it could have been just because my interpersonal skills were not the best because I was kind of isolated or whatever. But I think at the moment I'm just going to say that it was just because the male culture doesn't promote relationships the same way as the female culture does. So when I was welcomed into the female culture, it was very rewarding and warm for me because the relationships are different, the emotions are different, the feelings are different, conversations are different. The way we have conversations, the way we talk with each other. I can actually sit back and kind of watch a cisgender female and a cisgender male and how they interact, and I can tell whether the female may be a little guarded or she may be kind of interested. But these are things that most people don't necessarily realize or recognize, but you can see it when you step back and look at it, because only because I had the understanding of the perspective from before, where this is how the male is acting, and okay, so this is, and then I connected the behavior. So this is why this girl is acting the way she's acting with this guy, So it's kind of interesting to see the differences in behaviors, the differences in attitude. But even the kinds of stuff that's discussed, I mean, men are like, kind of rude. I don't mean to insult anyone in the room, but coming from the male culture where, their derogatory language and their references to women and just their ideas of how they want to treat these women was kind of rude and crude and rudimentary. Like, it was just like abrasive sometimes. But that's how guys talked. At least that's what I kind of understood, As I got older, I know that that's not the case. It's just, a segment of, but you're more inclined to talk that way with other men than you will with, mixed company in the room. And, but women talk about very personal and very intimate details and topics and subjects. And I love having conversations with other girls, other women about boyfriends and their relationships and that kind of thing. And it's like, but that's kind of a show of acceptance in that space. Like, you're having this conversation with me, so there's no difference between you and me. That's kind of how it makes me feel. What are we doing at time? Good. One of the things that is very difficult. So if you can imagine for a moment. I'll start with the idea that. So I want to make sure that everybody realizes that gender identity and sexual orientation have nothing to do with each other. One doesn't determine the other or predict the other, and one is not a result of the other. So one of the most common questions, and the reason I said that is because one of the most common questions I get, is if you're identifying as female now, then you must like men. Well, whether that's true or not, it doesn't make any difference. My gender identity does not determine that. My internal sense of who am I attracted to and that sort of thing determines, my partner. But relationships are very difficult because, again, with the men being, a majority of men being closed-minded, they're not at all interested in dating a trans woman because it's kind of former male, kind of somewhere in between. So there's a very big problem in their mind about dating trans women. Women typically don't necessarily date trans women either because whether they identify as bisexual or not, women will typically want to be with a cisgender female rather than someone who's transitioning from the male role into the female role. So dating is a very difficult and kind of a unique struggle for trans people. Even going the other way, trans men going into into the male role have a large amount of difficulty with dating and connecting with people that they would choose to date. And it's really just because when a woman identifies as a lesbian, she looks at it as, I would like to date another woman. A man who identifies as gay would like to date someone who is a guy, where someone who's bisexual will kind of go either to the one binary or the other, but not kind of in between, because it's kind of a weird space for them. So that makes it very difficult to date. Are there any questions at this point?
I have a question. I have a lot of questions. This is fascinating. Thank you for sharing this. This is a beautiful story. So you were talking about like when you were a kid and like you felt something was off. Did you identify that as identity?
Well, at 9 years old I didn't, but I did kind of know that it was different than what I was told I needed to be, and it was more. So I had a brother and a sister. So in the context of how my brother was living and how my sister was living, I had an affinity to live the way my sister was living versus the way my brother was living. So all the stuff that he did, I had really no desire to do that, but all the stuff my sister was involved in, I was like, all about that. So I guess I didn't realize it at the time, but yeah, it could have been very specifically identity.
And so when you made the decision that I'm going to transgender, did your family, are they still around? Like, did they accept you? Like,
Well, they mixed results on that. And I've actually, like, as I go through like the next section where I talk about like the things as social workers that we really want to know, I'm going to get more into depth with that. But there was, I mean, if you can imagine for a moment, mom and dad. So I traditional nuclear family, like where dad worked all the time, mom would stay at home, brother and sister, myself went to school. So when you have a family that's that dynamic and you are, I mean, at the time, I'm not going to disclose my age, but I was in my later 30s when I decided to come out and transition. These people had known me, my family had known me for 30 plus years as my former male self. And when I had come out as Sarah, my female identified self, there's a grieving process. Like, all of a sudden they're losing their son. Like, their son is gone. Like, how do I not have a son anymore, right? It's not nearly as bad as losing someone outright, but it's still a process because you have to grieve the loss of this person before you can accept and tolerate the new person. And I use tolerate for a reason, because at first, when I came out, my parents were tolerant, which is a very bad word for me. A lot of parents will just not at all deal with their child transitioning and will disown them. That's why the homelessness is what it is with the LGBTQ population. But yeah. So there was acceptance and then there was rejection as well. So.
What about siblings? Same thing, or?
Okay, so I'll get into that now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry, Don.
No. Yeah. Okay. So my parents, at first, it was a very kind of labored relationship, very difficult. It was all very fragmented. It was almost to the point of obliteration. It was like almost over. Like, but it also had to do with the way that I came out to them. I was very angry when I came out, but that was just the residual anger from being in for so long, and like all this anger and ambiguity around like who I am and being able to live my life the way I wanted to live. So I came out to them in a strong and maybe in a kind of an aggressive way. My mother immediately took on herself that it was her fault somehow, and that's a very common thing with a lot of the trans people I talk with. Parents blame themselves, especially the moms, because there's some sort of a biological component to it, and how could I have let this happen, or this, that, or whatever else. But it's not their fault. I mean, there are biological components to it, but there are so many other things to it as well. So my parents and I had a labor relationship. My brother decided, like, he's Mr. Macho military guy. Him and I have not spoken since. He chooses not to engage with me, and that's fine. I say that's fine. It took me a long time to get to the place where I said, okay, I can be okay with that. My sister and I kind of go back and forth, and it's still kind of a weird relationship, but we're working on it. I think the one that hurts the most, I have a daughter that's probably older than most of you in this room. And when I had come out to her, we had months worth of conversation prior to me coming out. Like, we were talking about the understanding of what trans identity meant, what transgender meant, what she knew about it, who she knew, how she would be if someone else came out. I set the stage, and we talked about it in depth, and we had a lot of conversation around it. But all it took was for me to say, okay, so this is what I needed to tell you. And so when I came out to her, which is, I like the idea of coming out as just a very difficult conversation. When I had this very difficult conversation with her, I was expecting her to be okay with it, because I raised her without her mother around from the time she was 2 until the time she was 16 years old. We had a really good relationship. We were tight, right? So I figured, I prepared her. We had a really strong relationship when she was growing up. So I think the stage is ready. Like let's kind of let her know where I'm at. And when I told her, she just about lost it and flipped out. And so, and she has not spoken to me since. She refuses to talk with me. She refuses to accept my identity as trans or as female. Again, she's going through the grieving process. She's losing a father that now wants to identify as what? A mother? I'm not a mother, right? So that's kind of a very weird concept for her. Like, how do I not identify this person as my father anymore? But then if I don't identify him as my father, who do I identify him as, right? So we have emailed on occasion, and the emails are kind of labored, and there's a lot of resentment in her responses. But the lines of communication are kind of still there, very vaguely there, but they're there. The hope is one day that, and hopefully one day soon, she'll kind of come to terms with the whole transition process, and we'll engage in conversation again. So. But that goes into like some of the stuff that we really need to consider as social workers when we're working with transgender identified people. We don't know their family history, their story, right? So all of this stuff that they've experienced in the process of being in the closet and stuck in that closet for so many years, and living in the darkness with the depression and the anxiety and all this self-loathing. We need to understand that, but beyond that, we need to understand how the dynamics of the family went when that person decided to come out. Are the parents still around? Are they not around? Did they outright reject? Did they kick the young person out of the home? It is easier for an older person to come out as trans because if they do get kicked out of the home, they will typically have resources to provide for themselves for a short period of time. Where obviously as a 15 or 16-year-old does not and will end up homeless. More often than not will end up homeless. So it's very important to consider how that relationship went with their family, both pre-transition and post-transition, because even post-transition, I know some trans-identified people that I speak with now, they've already transitioned, they're fully out, they're fully living as their identified male or female, but the family still does not recognize that, which is a very devaluing situation. It's very invalidating and very kind of damaging to that person, because I'm living in the world as who I am, but you're not accepting that, and I need you to accept that, because let's face it, we all want the acceptance and love of our parents, right? I mean, that's inherent with everyone. So that's important to keep in mind as we're working with young people or trans-identified people. But also, like we were also talking about, like the intersections of where we go with our gender. So that's all relative to where we go with the client as well, because we don't know what kind of oppression or discriminatory behaviors they've experienced. And we all know about oppression. I mean, there's overt, covert, and there's microaggressions. I mean, even walking into a grocery store, when you get that nasty look from the dude behind the counter, like, and I'm sorry, I just made a generalization, like the dude behind the counter. So when we go into the grocery store, we don't necessarily, so the person we see behind the counter may be female perceived, but may not identify like that. So we need to be mindful of that. But we need to know like how this person has been oppressed and how this person has experienced that oppression, because to have that guy or that girl give a nasty or gnarly look to that person is one thing. That's the action. But how that message is received is different. So a young person who's just coming out, that message is going to be very painful. It's going to be like, oh my God, like, am I really that bad of a human being that I deserve that kind of a look or that kind of, opinion lofted in my direction or that kind of action? For someone like me who's kind of gotten through a lot of that stuff and has reached that point of autonomy, the message is much different. The message is, well, you know what? You don't like it, you don't have to get to know me, that's fine, So there's varying degrees of acceptance and tolerance within that construct of of that message that I'm receiving. And I think just to know how that message is received is very important, because it's not about what we see. I mean, we can walk through the room and we can have a trans-identified person walk through, like, the mall, for example, and we can watch a bunch of people look at that person and give them nasty looks or supportive looks or whatever kind of looks they want. But it's not about what we perceive as the message being sent. It's what we have to understand, the message that's being received and how that affects the person. So one of the reasons that a lot of young people, especially trans people, will commit suicide is because that message is so impactful, so powerful to them, so it's so hateful, and it connects to their self-loathing. Like, they've self-loathed for so many years that message is like 10 times more hateful than it would be to anyone else, because I've hated myself for so long, and this person is just confirming that, right? And I don't mean to generalize, because my experiences are not anything like anybody else's experiences, but I'm kind of taking a little bit from a lot of the work that I do with trans people as well as my own experiences. So there are occasions when trans people can take a message like that and they can laugh it off, and it's not a big deal, while they're still kind of struggling with it on the inside. So I just want to make that. The other thing with oppression and discrimination, so those are kind of intangible things, right? We know that we're being discriminated against. We can feel it. When you have a sense that someone is treating you differently because of who you are, you know it. You feel it. Somehow, maybe you don't even recognize it at first, but you kind of know this feels different. This person is treating me kind of weird, right? And it's kind of like a gut feeling. What we also see, though, is we see a lot of violence perpetuated against transgender identified people. I'm not going to go into statistics right now, but we have had, now we're up to 23 trans-identified, especially women of color, trans women of color have been murdered this year already. This may be less than 0.1% of the entire population, but it's still a problem. One person's life is too many lives to lose, So violence is definitely something that, like most, and I'm going to even venture out to say that a majority of trans people will face violence in their lifetime, whether it's physical violence or it's, like the bullying kind of violence. And I say bullying kind of violence because there's a way to bully people to cause an intentional reaction, which would be to commit suicide. I think that's different than just, it's not physically harming the person, but it's emotionally damaging them to the point where they want to harm themselves. And I think that is not okay. Like, all of us know that's not okay, but when you treat somebody that way and you bully them to that extent where you're going to make them kill themselves, or you're going to kind of force them in that place where they're going to kill themselves, that's as bad as killing that person yourself, I feel like. But that's two different forms of violence that's perpetuated against trans people. I don't know if anybody agrees with that analogy or not, but that's kind of how I perceive it. And also, when trans people transition, so especially when someone like me who has come from this white male culture to this newly identified female culture, I had no idea what oppression, what discrimination, even what privilege looked like at that point. Nothing I ever did or said was challenged. I was just able to go and be me in those situations, and it was okay. There was never conflict, there was never resistance. But as I transitioned, I started to understand that, wow, this is what that privilege looked like. That privilege allowed me to not have to deal with this, not have to deal with discrimination, not oppression. But it also entitled me to a lot of things that I don't have that entitlement to anymore, which is a very unique change in perspectives, because Now, instead of walking into a place where I just walk and I just go because I'm okay to be there, I have to think about, well, is this the right place for me or not? Because it may not be. So a lot of that gender confusion and the orientation confusion can also lead to increased anxiety, increased depression, and there is even some correlation now with sexual orientation confusion and gender confusion and how it translates into borderline personality disorder. So that's another thing to consider too, that confusion, which can in a lot of ways feel like trauma, or the self-loathing, or the abusing the self, or self-medicating, the attempted suicides. That can all be trauma-based in the end, and result in some of the behaviors related to trauma, or as a result of the trauma. So I think these are all very important things to remember when we're working with young people. And behavior presentation is very important too. So when we're talking about someone who comes into our office and they are transgender identified, and we're going to sit down, we're going to do a 50-minute hour with them, and their behavior seems a little erratic, a little bit kind of heightened, a little bit nervous, a little fidgety. Normally you would say, well, that's not necessarily a baseline for someone who's coming in for therapy, but for a trans person, it's probably baseline for them. Because most trans people, and again, I don't want to generalize, but most trans people are very socially awkward. I know I was very socially awkward for a while. In that process of isolating and secluding myself and being socially awkward, I did not develop the most appropriate socialization skills or interpersonal relationship skills. So my interactions with people were kind of difficult sometimes. I can be difficult. But also based on kind of not knowing how to interact with that person because of my deficits. I had some problems communicating. I had some problems, one of my friends tells me, just use your words. Well, using my words is not something a pacifist does. We try to avoid that, the conflict or the confrontation. We try to kind of, mediate the emotions by not dealing with it. Which, of course, is not the way to deal with it. But you can look at a client and you can actually see, if you really talk to them and investigate their interpersonal relationships, a lot of trans people will not have long-term relationships because of all of this stuff we just talked about. Poor interpersonal relationship skills, lack of socialization, or good, solid socialization skills. So we need to understand that. So they may not have the support network that we have. I have a phenomenal support network now, but prior to kind of working through all of this and kind of clearing the way, I didn't have a support network, and it was probably better that way because I was not a very nice person per se. I mean, I was dealing with my own issues, and I was, kind of not okay with the world. And you, as a person in that world, you were part of my issue, right? But now it's much different. So we got to understand where the trans person is at as far as their ability to communicate and have relationships. And of course, rejection, that brings on a whole entirely new set of realities for a young person that we need to really be aware of. If a young person is rejected by family or friends, the very first thing that happens is they internalize that and they realize that, hey, this is just validating all of my negative self-talk and my self-hatred, my self-loathing. This is just confirming all of that for me. So I was not wrong when I said I hated myself because I am different, because that person hates me and this person hates me and this person hates me. So we take all of that in, we internalize all of that. And before you know it, it's so easy to get lost in that self-loathing and negative self-talk that we don't even realize we're doing it sometimes. A lot of trans people will not realize that they're doing it. One of the things that I work a lot with trans people is trying to change their narrative. Instead of being different, instead of being unacceptable or disapproved or, not self-liked, not liked by anybody else. So it's really important to try and get that person to understand themselves, to like themselves first, because nobody else matters. And I don't say that because, we all need people. We all need friends. We all need family. But at the end of the day, I'm going to go home with myself. I'm going to get up with myself. And I'm the only one I have to live with. So if I can like myself, then that's going to reflect and project onto other people, and people are going to pick that up. That positive attitude, that positive emotion, that feeling is just going to radiate from me. And then people are going to realize that. They're going to say, wow, so maybe trans people aren't that bad. And I say that for a reason, because that's what a lot of people think. People think that trans people are weird, crazy, dysfunctional. It's getting better with a lot of the education out there now is actually dispelling a lot of those things. But people are also not sure how to navigate that space. So, okay, I don't know how to be the friend of a trans person. Well, that's really simple. Just be that person's friend. Just say, hey, what do you want to do today? It's not about gender. It's about me being a person, you being a person, and us interacting. That's it. It's not about, my trans identity. It has nothing to do with that. But because people don't know enough about the trans identity, they tend to stay away from it or avoid it just because they don't want to say the wrong thing, they don't want to do the wrong thing. It is kind of a weird place to be when you're around someone who's different, for at least at first, because you don't know how to get to know that person. Well, for me, I'm an open book. You've got questions, come up and ask me. I've got answers, and I love to talk. So I can talk, and I can, whatever. But for me, there's just about no inappropriate or unnecessary questions, except if you want to talk about like my sexual orientation. That's kind of a personal one for me. I keep that to myself. And the biggest question: never ask a trans person, "Have you had the surgery?" Don't. That is the most offensive conversation starter question that you'll ever ask a trans person. Have you had the surgery? Beyond that, other than talking about so you're transitioning into a female, so you must be attracted to men, don't go into that conversation either. But other than that, most trans people are very open and welcoming to questions, conversation. Like myself, a majority of trans people know that or realize that, hey, the only way that you're going to understand and not be afraid of me or not think that I'm weird or different is by talking to me. So if I can give you that space to open up and ask me questions, then you're going to get the answers that you want, which is going to kind of formulate your own opinion about me, and then you're going to realize, hey, I'm just like everyone else. So I think that's kind of where I'll leave it. Discrimination. I have been discriminated against. Again, not as a former male-identified person, but I have been. I had a situation when I first came out with a UPD officer. It was not very nice, kind of derogatory in his presentation and also in his language. But fortunately, I had. I don't know if anybody knows Courtney Diallard, but he is in charge of the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, and he's extremely involved in, overly involved sometimes in the LGBTQ concerns on campus. He's part of the advisory committees and a bunch of different other things around LGBTQ identities. And I had reached out to him. I had to navigate that space because that was the very first time I'd ever experienced true in the moment discrimination that was not being. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He was just. His look, his attitude, his demeanor, and the language he used was very specific to degrade me in that situation. It was to make me realize that he felt like I was not okay in his mind, right? So anyway, Courtney and I had the conversation, and he had gone to Chief Wiley, and then, so I don't know what happened after that, but that was dealt with. Ironically, there are two other UPD officers that have now become relatively good friends of mine, that know this other person, and one of them tried to explain away the other officer's attitude at the time while he was going through some stuff. He had this going on, this going. Not okay. Like, I'm going through stuff all the time, but it doesn't give me the right to be mean or nasty to someone, or hold a derogatory opinion about someone, or to discriminate against someone. That's not okay. So we had that conversation, and he understood my point of view. He's like, no, you're right. It doesn't make it right. So even with jobs, like supervisors, I've had issues with supervisors. Never prior in my male role have I ever had a problem ever on a job, or whatever. After that, the heteronormative, kind of male-identified individual, the attitudes changed, and I've had some problems with some supervisors because of that as well. And the types of jobs that I get, like before I used to apply for a job, and it was almost guaranteed that I'd get it. Now I apply for 10 jobs, and I'm lucky if I get one offer. So it's kind of weird how that works, but. And we already talked about like the accessibility. My accessibility to different places and different spaces has changed, or has not allowed me to take certain jobs, or not allowed me to pursue certain careers, just because of the nature of the game. So, and there are, if you've been paying attention over the last year, there's been a lot of progress with the trans community. A lot of progress with the equality and equity of trans people. A lot of service provisions, that kind of thing, are now in place. But we still have a long way to go. When we talk about equality and equity, I think we all know the difference. So everyone has a right to a pair of shoes, right? And that would be equal treatment of services. But when you talk about equity, that's not always the case. So everybody has the right to a pair of shoes that fits, right? That's the difference between equal and equitable services. So we have a long way to go. Like we're putting policy and implementing new healthcare protocol and everything else around the transgender identity. But you're still in the mental health arena. It's still, you deal with everybody across the board. With a lot of exceptions actually, but as far as trans-identified people go, you're going to deal with their anxiety the same as you're going to deal with everyone else's anxiety. Their suicidal ideation is the same, but that's not equitable, because the difference is the severity and the extent and the levels and the duration of that anxiety and depression is much different than a lot of other people. So I think we have a long way to go on that. So I guess. Any questions?
I have two things that I would just love to hear sort of your thoughts or experience or perspective on. One is, and I guess particular to your work with youth, maybe just, and I realize this is a difficult request to just summarize this, but it'd be interesting to hear you talk a little bit about the diversity of trans experience and trans identities that you see among young people. I think that's really helpful for us as social workers to recognize just how the range of coming to identity and expressions of identity, and I work a bit with non-binary young folks. Yeah. And then secondly, I'm really interested in sort of the double-edged sword of clinical social work's current trends in service to trans folks, particularly with the DSM, and how a diagnosis helps many trans people access services, but at the same time also is diagnosing somebody's experience and identity and kind of assigning some stigma. And I recognize that diagnosis has particularly changed recently, but still carries potentially a little stigma with it. So just any general thoughts on either of those?
I'll start with the second question. It's an incredibly good question, because the DSM-4 used to consider gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder as two separate under one umbrella, like under gender identity disorder. Gender dysphoria is considered the extreme discontent with one's physical body and not matching the mental perception of who they are. When the DSM-5 came out, they took out gender identity disorder because it makes it sound like there was something wrong with the individual, and they've changed it to dysphoria, gender dysphoria. And what that did is it allowed all these service provision agencies, healthcare, Medicaid, medical, all these doctors and whatever, it redefined their approach to working with trans people, because now it kind of forced them in a way to put in protocol and procedures around working with, and what kind of procedures, what kind of medical coverage, what kind of service provisions are needed for trans people. Because it was kind of like back in 1972 when they declassified and demystified homosexuality. Well, you're taking this now out of the mental health arena and you're putting it into like the medical arena, which changes the way you approach it. There is still the mental health diagnosis of gender dysphoria, but that's often going to be someone who is really, really, really discontented with who they are physically, because it doesn't match who they are mentally. And I experienced dysphoria for a while because I hated looking at myself as who I was as a male in the mirror. But when you diagnose that means that there's other provisions and other protocol in place that would warrant surgery. That would warrant, it would allow surgery, I guess. Whereas just gender identity disorder that doesn't exist anymore, now you put that into the medical arena now that hormones are covered, you got electrolysis can be covered, you have, the surgeries are now covered, Medicaid and the marketplace, the Obamacare put into place all kinds of provisions around what's covered, what's not covered, and what should be covered for trans people in the health insurance policies. So once Obama kind of revamped the policy around trans-identified people with the Medicaid, all the other insurance companies now have to follow suit. So now there's protocol. But what also happens now is that the medically necessary therapy, the 50-minute hour, that wasn't normally covered because we don't want to recognize this as a medical thing, this is a psychological thing, is now covered under the healthcare plans because it's medically necessary to help the person kind of come to terms with who they are and also navigate the new identity. But it's also required. You have to remain in therapy for one year consistently in order to have the surgery anyway. So now the therapy sessions are covered under the insurance as well. As far as speaking to young people, there is a lot more information out there nowadays. There's a lot of people out there, like Courtney and myself and some people here at the Social Welfare, like a lot of people in different agencies that are out there really kind of advocating for, trying to educate people around the transgender identity. Once you do that, it tends to normalize it a lot. It makes it not such a, this is a bad thing, but, oh, okay, well, maybe I don't know enough about it. So more young people are coming out earlier, which is a lot easier on the person because then it changes the treatment methods as well, because you can do hormone suppressions, which will not allow the male characteristics necessarily to create or generate, or the female characteristics, secondary characteristics to develop prior to puberty and then throughout puberty. That's they're coming out younger, but they're also more educated, and there's more people that are understanding and accepting and tolerant of the transgender identity at younger ages now. It's the older trans people that have the most problem because they've already gone through puberty, they've already established their primary and secondary male and female gender characteristics. And they're kind of stuck with those, so it's kind of hard to pass as an older person. But young people nowadays can pass very easily. So, I've been in a room where there was two trans people in that room, and not one of the other people in the room even knew it. But I did just because I knew the person out of context. They didn't even know. So it's between the education, but it's also like the ability to pass. So young people are finding it a lot more easier to come out. But again, considering the fact that they're also at higher risks of homelessness and, but they still struggle with the same things. I mean, don't get me wrong, they still struggle with the anxiety, the depression, the suicidal ideation. I would almost say that you're very, very, very rarely going to find any trans person who has not at least considered suicide. I mean, I could be wrong, but, but yeah, young people are, and they're more accepting. Like, I work at an agency locally here with, teenage girls, and not a worry, not a care in the world about who I am. They've accepted me and embraced me in that space, and they don't care. It's the older people that care. So.
You've mentioned a couple times the concept of like passing. I had an experience. It was a long time ago, but it still resonates with me, and it's kind of like a processing moment. I'd like to process and kind of get your feedback on it. It was probably about 8 years ago or so. Somebody who had come in, and she was in her transition. She very, very recently had started dressing as female, I guess is that how we word that? And kind of like anybody, whenever you're doing anything new or different, or kind of just trying to find her way of like, what is my style? What do I like? What do I not like? So a couple times she had come in with super, like very, like short skirt, and she was very upset because somebody on the bus had harassed her. And so we had talked, and it was so hard for me because on the one hand I wanted to be accepting of like, it's awesome you're wearing a skirt, that you feel comfortable in it, you love doing this, wonderful, that's wonderful. But then on the other hand, really, especially, I mean, as women, we have to be careful sometimes, and we shouldn't have to be careful. We should be able to wear whatever we want. It's never okay. This is where I'm struggling. It's never okay for anybody ever to attack you or to come at you in any way, regardless of what you're wearing. It's never okay. But at the same time, as women, we still have to be aware of that. And so for me, it was kind of like a balance between, I'm so excited for you that you're expressing yourself and that you're starting this process, but then on the other hand, like, we have to be concerned about your safety too. It's like I felt like I was sending such a mixed message, because it was like, we have to be careful with your safety, but I'm also really wanting you to express yourself and be you.
Yeah.
Feedback.
Well, I mean, so I think again, I don't want to generalize, but I think when a lot of trans people come out, especially trans women, I think we tend to overcompensate a little bit at first, but the reality will set in very quickly. It's also not knowing how to, like, I want to express myself to the fullest extent as a female, but also knowing that boundary or that limit, and also the inherent stuff that comes along with that kind of risque kind of dressing will settle in very quickly. Unfortunately, it's kind of like we have to learn our lesson before we can, learn how to appropriately dress. It may just be overcompensation. It may just be. There could be obviously a lot of things behind that, but I think it may just be overcompensation at this point.
Yeah.
So.
And we did. I mean, we explored that, and we kind of explored what is it to you to dress as a female. How do you like to dress, and how do you feel most female, and how do you, and we did exploring about that, but I had just always worried that the message that came out was, no, tone it down. But that's not what I had intended. But
Yeah.
so with that discussion too, like the safety discussion is necessary.
Yeah, and necessary and appropriate.
Okay.
I think sometimes people don't necessarily realize that they're doing something wrong, or that they're doing something that potentially is dangerous, unless somebody kind of points it out to them. So, I mean, I think the conversation was very appropriate, as you know, as long as it was like the safety was the concern rather than how she was presenting. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, thank you. It was more just, I think it's been eating at me for like 8 years, so I really needed some feedback. So
I would suspect by now she's got a better understanding of the realities behind dressing like that, and I mean, you never know, but. Anyone else?
Jess.
Jess.
I have like a strange question, but I also have like a comment. I hope that in saying this, I'm not like at all minimizing your experience, but I just think that your amazing insight and in the beginning of your talk when you were comparing like your previous identified self and how you and the privileges that you got to, I think that's so unique and so awesome, and I hope that's not at all offensive.
No, not at all.
Just completely awe-inspiring, like completely fascinating to me. And I think that's just so amazing that you have that experience. And I just wanted to also say that I think you're so courageous for reporting your incident of discrimination that you shared with us. Like so many people would just have let that go and like not have done anything about it. And I think it's so awesome to be an advocate for yourself and for others like that. And my question is, when you're working with clients in the field, have you ever experienced someone who was hesitant to work with you because of who you are? And like, how did you handle that and go about that if that has happened?
That's an interesting question too, because that was what I had fully expected. I really thought that people were going to be, you know, especially clients are looking at me like, really? Like, how does this work, right? I have met with victims, especially like, so I do the sexual assault hotline,
Right.
and going to the hospital with a female victim is kind of a very scary space at first, because you never know how that female is going to react to me. Even though I present as female, there's still that perception of male sometimes. It's not been a problem at all. Like even young people or older people, victims of sexual assault, I've not run into one situation yet where I've had an issue with a client, which is actually kind of amazing. Like I expected that kind of regularly. So I actually did, like I applied for my second year internship at St. Anne community-based program. And based on the population that they work with, which are younger male sex offenders, I actually had a problem, like not a problem, like I chose not to go there because I didn't know how my being transgender was going to fit in with that population. And I didn't have enough time to navigate that in my mind to see how that would look and kind of flesh it out and figure out if I could work in that population or not. So, but I could imagine that might be a situation where that may be a problem, but other than that, no. Yes.
So I have another question is on digesting some of the thoughts or responses you gave to some of my earlier ones. And again, thinking about some of the gender non-conforming or like non-binary identifying trans folks that I work with, like younger folks that I work with, so people who identify as trans but don't claim a male, a uniquely male or female identity.
Yeah.
I feel like so much of, so I'd love your feedback on how we can improve our work as social workers, because I feel like so much of our field, even in some of the criteria for even the new diagnosis, is very binary rooted.
Right.
Things like intake forms. So, while many trans or non-conforming folks might have difficulty with a male or female checkbox,
Right.
certainly for the people who, rather than identifying across a binary spectrum, don't identify within that spectrum, there's that added challenge to the checkbox. There's the added challenges when various diagnoses are rooted in a binary, or the types of questions we ask, or
Right.
even in discussions when we frame things. I was in a class the other day, and I forget what the example was, but we talk about working, say, with a client. We're giving an example in a class discussion. And we say, so if you work with a client and he or she asks you, well, it's great that we're not saying he asks you or she asks you, we're saying he or she.
Right.
but not all people claim a he or she identity.
Right.
So I don't know if there's any just thoughts you have for us as social workers or emerging social workers, how to best incorporate awareness of that.
Yep. I think the first part of that is having conversation with the agencies and with the mental health professionals that gender is fluid, right? It resides on a spectrum, and a person can identify anywhere within that spectrum. Really, just about anything is on a spectrum. I mean, if you think about like orientation or even ethnic or racial affiliations are kind of fluid. I mean, you can reside anywhere in a cultural background. You can be extremely culturally aware and involved, or you can be not so, or you could be right in the middle. So I think having the conversation about a person's identity being completely fluid, and it's up to that person to identify how they want to identify. A lot of the gender nonconforming or transgender, or like transgender in essence is like the umbrella term for anyone who would be kind of identify under that umbrella term as gender nonconforming or somewhere on that spectrum between male and female binary. But a lot of the people who don't want to necessarily identify as a gender at all will use they or them as terminology, which you can't put necessarily in an intake form, but you can put other, which is like the most minimalist kind of recommendation on a form. You can put other, so male, female, or other. I know at my internship right now, there's male, female, trans male, trans female, male to female, female to male, intersexed, and like a couple other options for the intake. But that's a progressive agency. Most agencies do not necessarily have the room or the time, nor the will or desire to put something like that into an intake form. It's just people come in, they're either male or female. We all make that assumption too, like when we go to the grocery store and the person behind the counter hands me my change, and I'm like, have a nice day, ma'am. I just made an assumption, right? But we all put people in the categories. We put them in boxes, either male, female, or a person of color, or Hispanic, or Latino, or trans, or I mean, everything's a label, and we do that. So I don't know. I think just making sure that the agencies are kind of equipped with the idea and the knowledge that identity is on the spectrum. They help kind of diffuse some of that.
This is, I guess, my social worker hat is on my personal question, like for myself. I'm someone who's currently transitioning, and everything you described fits his, like the anger, the anxiety, the depression, it's all heightened right now. And what can I do as a person in his life? Because I know it's different from social work. I'm not going to say things I would to my clients.
It is much different, yes.
So, what did you wish you had in that stage?
I think just being there as a support and non-judgmental, non-directive, just him, you said? Him. Just let him kind of navigate that space and know that you're there for him, I think. Because most trans people just really want somebody to know, it's kind of like sitting in that space with someone. Like it's kind of, you don't necessarily have to talk about it, but just to know that you're sitting there in that space with me makes it all that much better. So I think. And I can give you some resources after if you'd like.
I think it's time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for having me.